Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today we are processing the Western Veil Nebula. And we've already gone through in part one of this two-part series and processed the image in PixInsight. And now we're ready to go into Photoshop. If you're familiar with my process, you know that I use PixInsight primarily to produce these 16-bit TIFF files so that they're ready to be used in Photoshop. And generally that means that you need a TIFF file format or something that Photoshop can read. And I need the 3 monochrome images from the narrowband filters, the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then I also produced 2 versions of the stars, one with sharp stars and one with fluffy stars. And with that, let's go to Photoshop. And the first thing I'm going to do is load all of these files as layers. So I'll go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and that will open this dialog box. And we'll click Browse to go pick the files that we want to open, and just navigate to the folder where those are saved. And there are the 5 files we just created in PixInsight. I'll click OK. That loads the file list. Click OK again. And that will actually load each one of these files as a layer. And let's talk a little bit about Photoshop and the structure of Photoshop and the layers. Over on the lower right hand side, this is the layers palette. And right now it's showing 5 layers. And they're just stacked one on top of the other, and they're all, you could think of them as being opaque. In other words, you can't see through the top layer to see what's below. I can turn off the top layer using the eyeball over here. If I just click on that, that'll turn it off. And now I see the layer that's below it. If I click the eyeball, check again, that will turn it back on. And you can see the 5 layers. We have the hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and then we have our fluffy stars, and then our sharp stars. And this really shows that difference between the 2 processes. So let's start with the stars and kind of get those out of the way. I work a lot with layer groups, which means I will put these 2 layers into a single group, and then that single group acts like a layer. So to do that, I'm going to use a few keyboard shortcuts as we go through here. I'm going to click on one, shift click on the second one, so now I've selected both of those layers, and then I'll use a keyboard shortcut of Control G to put those 2 layers into a group. And I can just double click on where it says Group 1 and change that to stars. I can use the little caret here to open and close that group. And here's the fluffy stars on top of the sharp stars. Now, I said before that each one of these layers is opaque. In other words, you can't see through one to the other one. But I can change the blending mode that determines how those layers interact with one another. And what we want to do with the fluffy stars is just use it to brighten the area around the sharp stars, but we still want to see the sharp stars. So I'm going to change the blending mode. This drop down right here where it says normal. If I click on that, you'll see there's a whole list of different blending modes. And the one I'm going to choose is lighten. So now we're seeing through this layer to the one below, and it's lightening any place where this layer is brighter than the one below. It adds to it or brightens it. And so what we'll do is adjust the layer opacity, which is the slider right here where it says opacity. And Photoshop has what's called scrubby sliders. You see if I move the cursor over the word opacity, I get a finger with a little arrow pointing in either direction. And that may be hard to see on YouTube. But what that lets you do is just hover the cursor over the word and then click and drag back and forth. And you can see that's changing the opacity. So that's all the way down to 0, That's 100%. And we just try to find a spot somewhere in between that we think visually looks attractive. Until we get this over top of a nebula, we really can't judge very well. So at this point, I'm going to do two more things. I'm going to change the stars mode to screen. And that's for the entire group. And the reason we want that is because when we ran Star Exterminator, we ask Star Exterminator to use the unscreen process to remove the stars. So we'll use the screen process to put them back in. I'll close this group. And in Windows, by the way, whenever you use this blending mode drop-down, it grabs the cursor focus, and your keyboard shortcuts won't work until you press Escape. So I'm just going to drag it up to the top because we're going to add it at the top, and we'll turn it off for now. So now we have to work with each one of our narrowband images, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but I'm going to use the same process that I normally use. The first thing I'm going to do is put it in a group by itself. So select hydrogen, Control G, double click where it says Group 1, and change the name. Now I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer, and since I'm on the layer group name, if I just simply click on this adjustments, and this will add a levels adjustment layer. If I click on that, since the group is open, it will add it below the name, which is exactly where I want it. So within the group, I have the base layer and then a levels adjustment layer that we'll use to adjust the brightness of this layer. We need to do some cleanup on this, so I'm going to click on the hydrogen layer itself, and mostly we need to clean up some of these artifacts around the star. To do that, I'm going to grab the healing brush, actually the spot healing brush, and you can see that we've got, to start with, some diffraction spikes. I can use the left and right bracket keys to make that brush larger or smaller, and I can just paint over that diffraction spike, or I can just click on a spot, and basically what I'm doing is looking for the areas that are really, the biggest offenders. And you can see there's still kind of a glow going on here, where it looks like some of the, sometimes you have to guess, is that a truly something that's there in the image, or is that an artifact from star removal? What's left is a bit of a smudge and a bright spot, and I want to knock that down. You can see there's still detail that you can see through that smudge, so we want to be careful we don't just go in here. You don't want to use something like the clone stamp tool and start obliterating this. What we really want to do is just make this bright area darker. And to do that, I'm going to use what's called burning and dodging. And we'll do that on a separate layer so that it's non-destructive. So here's the layer I just added by clicking on the Add a Layer icon at the bottom. And I'm going to put this in soft light blending mode. And the reason we like soft light is if I paint on this layer with a dark color, black or gray, it will darken what's below. If I paint with white or a light color, it will lighten what's below. So we'll start by darkening. I want to choose the brush tool. I can tap B on the keyboard to get the brush. I want black as my foreground, and I'm going to change the opacity to about 10%, which I can do by just tapping the 1 key. That sets the opacity for the brush at about 10%. Now, when I paint with black at 10% opacity, you can see its effect is that it's just darkening this area. And you can really even go to smaller and smaller brushes and progressively darken areas that are too light. If you go too far, just tap the X key and that'll swap white to the foreground, and then you can lighten areas. And you may even want to connect some some dots in here. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can go through here and make this as perfect as you want. It can be time consuming. Sometimes you have to zoom out to get a little bit bigger view. And we'll just call that good enough. Now the last thing I want to do is, you can see that we've got in the background area, we still have a lot of star residuals. So I'm going to use the dust and scratches filter to knock those out. And to do that, I want to work on a smart object rather than the layer itself, because that would be destructive to actually apply a filter to the layer. So I'm going to include this soft light layer. So I'll click and shift click to select both layers. Right click to the right of the name and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now, if I apply the Dust and Scratches filter, which is under Noise, Dust and Scratches, I just find a setting, and it's going to be somewhere probably in the 10 to 20 range, where it will knock out those little star residuals without a huge impact on the background. Click OK. Sometimes that leaves the background too smooth, so the next thing I typically would do is add some noise. So go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise, and somewhere around 4% should work fine. What this does is it just keeps it from being too smooth, and you want the noise to kind of match the rest of the image. And again, those settings will vary depending on your camera. Now the easiest thing to do, you can see that my smart filters in the layer palette, it has its own mask. I can have a mask for the layer group, I can have a mask for the layer, I can have a mask just for the smart filters. So if I click on this mask for the smart filters, you can see that creates a bit of a double outline around it. I want to just invert this mask, so instead of showing all, it hides all. And to do that, I can just do Control-I on the keyboard to invert that mask. Now the effect of these smart filters is hidden, all that noise has come back, but now on the mask I can paint with white at 100%, which is 0 on the keyboard. And if you can see the residuals here, I just click. I can paint around details with a very small brush and knock out just those little residuals. As we get into areas with less detail, I can paint with a bigger brush, and we'll just paint with a fairly broad brush here and knock out all of these star residuals. And if you look at the layer thumbnail, you can see where we've hidden it and where it's being applied. So something like that. The last thing we'll do is come up to this levels adjustment layer, and we know we're going to want to probably darken the background. You'll see that this really can wait until later to fine-tune this. So at this point I'm just going to turn this off, and we'll go to the next layer down, which is the oxygen, and I'm going to kind of quickly go through this. Control-G to put it into a group, add a levels adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer too. You'll see why in a little bit. Click on the layer itself, tap J for the healing brush. Let's look at our star up here. Again, we've got this big diffraction spike. I can click at one end, shift click at the other end, and it draws a line connecting those two. Anytime you're going across a structure like this, if you draw across it, it does a pretty good job of retaining that line. So at this point I'm just trying to knock this down to kind of a gray. Now we'll add our soft light layer. Go to a brush with black at 10% opacity, and we'll darken this down, clean this up a little bit, and we're really just trying to bring back the detail that's there. It was just hidden behind the star removal artifact. Turn this into a smart object. Go to Noise, Dust and Scratches to knock the star residual out of the background. Add noise so that it blends well. Click on the mask for the smart filters, Control-I to invert it. Take my brush to 100% opacity and make it a little larger, and we'll just paint away all of these star artifacts that are still there. Now we're not affecting the main part here, we're just really just affecting the background. And I didn't change the name. And the last one we have is sulfur. Again, I'll just quickly go through this. Feel free to skip through this if you want, because it's all going to look very repetitive. If there's any place where we have big artifacts, we'll knock those out. I think that was real. And now we'll add our soft light layer to do some burning and dodging. 10% opacity with black. We'll darken this down so it blends. Convert this to a smart object. And yes, I know this is very repetitive. Dust and scratches. Dust and scratches, by the way, used to be how you would remove stars in the days before all of the StarNet++ and Star Exterminator. It was tedious, and you usually had to run it multiple times, but it did work, and you could get a starless image the old-fashioned way. And so we've inverted the mask. 100% opacity with white. We'll paint back in. The dust and scratches. And there we have a fairly cleaned up image. Now the fun part begins, because now we're going to start adding color. And we want to make this an SHO image, but I'm not sure exactly where the H is going to be. We know we want sulfur to be red, we want oxygen to be a blue-green, and we want hydrogen somewhere in the middle. It could be just barely off of red into orange a little bit. It could be very green or somewhere in the middle. And we'll figure that out interactively and visually. And it's actually quite easy to turn this into a color image. And typically what I do is start with an SOO image, sulfur, oxygen, oxygen. So we have our sulfur layer on the bottom, and this is an RGB image, so it has all three color channels, red, green, and blue. In the end, we're only going to use the red channel from this, but what we're really going to do is replace the green and blue with the green and blue from oxygen. So to do that, let's turn on the oxygen layer, and we want just green and blue from this layer, no red. So I will go to the oxygen group, double click, and this will bring up this blending options dialog box. If you look here in the center, you can see there's the three channels, red, green, and blue, and all three have a check mark. What we want to do is turn off the red channel and let the red channel from below come through. And so I just unclick R and click OK, and we now have an SOO image. And we can start to get a little bit of a feel for how the overall balance works. If I want the sulfur to be a little bit brighter, I can go down to the sulfur layer and to its levels adjustment layer, and I can brighten the red. If I start getting red in the background, I can darken the blacks. And I'm basically just trying to create a somewhat pleasing and somewhat balanced SOO image at this point. We've got the oxygen is pretty cyan. It has equal amounts of green and blue. I tend to like it a little bit more towards just the blue. So to do that, we're going to go to the oxygen layer. And remember, we're just getting green and blue from the oxygen layer. But I'm going to use this curves adjustment layer that we put in earlier, or if you didn't put it in earlier, you can put it in now. And we have a drop down on curves and levels in a lot of the adjustment layers where we can target specific channels. In this case, I'm going to target the green channel. And so this is the curve that's going to only affect the green channel. If I grab the top right hand corner here and drag down, you'll see that I'm taking away some of the green and making this more of a blue rather than a cyan. And usually when you do that, you may have to come back to your levels adjustment and pump it up a little bit. And then we may need to take the black layer level down just a little. So that's a pretty decent looking SOO image, but we're not done yet. We still need to add the hydrogen. And you'll see me zooming in and out quite a bit. And I will also frequently change the color of the background. Right now it's gray. If I change it to black, that gives me a good visual indication of how dark the background is and how neutral it is. And it looks like I maybe need to take just a little bit more red out of the background. Okay, let's go to our hydrogen. Hydrogen is really where you create the color balance. I'm going to turn the hydrogen layer on, and initially it's just overlaying everything. So we want to change the blending mode from pass-through to screen. And when you do that, it will make it too bright. So let's open up the hydrogen group. We have our levels adjustment layer, and we can change the brightness of this. But what we really want to do is change the color also. So I don't have a curves adjustment layer here, so I'm going to add one. And when you add an adjustment layer, it will by default add on top of the currently selected layer, right, which is exactly where we want it. And again, let's start by going to the blue. Typically in an SHO image, you would have no blue or very little blue. So let's just grab the top right corner and we'll pull blue out of the image. And you can see the color of it starting to change already. Now we can play with the balance between red and green. Right now we have both red and green, which would give us an orange color. If we want it to be more green, we could go to the red, take red out. That makes it more of a green color. If we want it to be more orangey red, we could go to the green and take it out. And I'm actually kind of liking it with this orange color. That differentiates it from the red of the sulfur. Gives it a pretty nice balance. We can adjust the intensity by going back to the levels layer. And because it's in screen blending mode, it will have a bit of an outsized impact. So that's a pretty good starting point at this point. If we want to revisit our oxygen green content, we can come back, pull a little bit more green out, get a little bit more blue in it, and then when we do that, because blue is a fairly dark color, we may feel like we need to brighten it a little bit. But this is all, very iterative. You can play with this back and forth. The last thing I would do, and of course you could work on this for a long time, the last thing I would do is with the above the hydrogen group and below the stars, I want to add a set of adjustment layers. So first we're going to add a levels, which we'll use for just our overall brightness and contrast. And we'll say we want something like that. I will usually add a color balance and then a hue saturation, and you can use those to play with the saturation. You can use the color balance, obviously, if you want to tweak the color a little bit. That's a real good way to do it. We still have some odd noise in the background, so I'm going to come up here and add a solid fill layer, and you have to do that by going to this little yin-yang symbol at the bottom. Add a solid color layer, and I want this to be almost black, so something around 17, 18, 19 RGB, and I'm looking at the color readout over here, so there's 17, 17, 17, and we'll put this in lighten blending mode. Now what this is doing, and you watch some of the area up here, for instance, when I turn this layer on and off, you'll see that it's creating basically a floor or a bottom darkness layer level, so that nothing will be darker than 17, 17, 17. And it helps smooth out some of these background areas that are really nothing but noise. You could obviously continue tweaking this as much as you want, but that's not a bad place to start. I might throw a little bit more of the red from the sulfur into the image, but not in the background. Now we've got some areas that overall this looks pretty good. There's a couple areas where we're getting a lot of noise. We've got some vignetting in the corners, a little bit over here. Basically these areas are too bright. So I'm going to go to the hue saturation layer, which is just below the solid color fill layer, and I'm going to add a blank layer, and again I'm going to put it in soft light blending mode. And what this will let me do is use my burning and dodging tools at a fairly large level. So over here where I'm really just seeing a lot of noise, if I start by darkening this, and let's go to 10% opacity, and we can start darkening it down so that it's just overall just below that dark threshold that we set with the solid fill layer. And this helps clean up that background. You can also, burning and dodging, you can just burn and dodge. If we want to brighten some of this nebula, we can switch to white and maybe brighten some of these areas, and maybe switch back to black, darken some of this. You know, there's no reason that you can't. You know, this is already nonlinear data. It's not scientific data at this point. So, you know, do what you feel like you need to do to make the image look good artistically. And up here in the corner, we've got some vignetting, so I'm going to add, I'm just painting over and over and driving that to black. Same way up here, there's nothing useful to see there. Just throw a little bit more saturation in. And we probably should add some stars. We've got the stars layer right here. I'll turn that on, and there are the stars. Now it starts to make sense to look at the balance between the fluffy stars and the sharp stars. So that is 0, that's 100%. It's just a matter of taste, what you think looks good. The sharp stars may need reduced a little bit, and to do that we'll go to the sharp star layer, and we'll add a levels adjustment layer right above it, and then using the midpoint slider we can darken those down and kind of minimize the small stars. And then lastly, like I say, the star color is really not coming through at this point, so we will add a hue saturation adjustment layer at the top of all of the stars, but within the stars group. And when I add saturation, now it's adding it only to the stars. And we'll call that kind of a finished image. If you want to tweak it a little bit more, you can always go, for instance, back to the color balance. That looks even better, doesn't it? Play with color balance, play with hue saturation, play with the relative brightness of any one of the narrowband layers. It's all very iterative, and by leaving these layers intact, I can save this image and come back to it later, tomorrow, next week, next year, and continue adjusting. I think the last thing I'm going to do is go to hue saturation. I'm going to target the reds with that drop down, and I'm going to increase the red saturation a little bit, and I'm going to shift the color of the reds to be just a little bit more red, and maybe brighten them up a little bit with the lightness. And I'm going to quit here. I think that's pretty good. At this point, what I would do in my normal workflow is save this as a PSB file. So go to File, Save As, and now it's a finished image. So I'm going to save it in my 2023 photos, and I have to save this as a large document format. Western Veil, half hours, SHO for the video. And this will be around a probably a 10 gigabyte file. It'll be a big file. So that's it. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, be sure to drop them in the comments down below. I'll be happy to try to help you out. If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and you'll get to see more of these videos as I produce them. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky.